All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Today we have on Karissa Johnson. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, no, me too. Me too. Anytime we can kind of broach the idea of looking at a population that doesn't get a lot of pub and research, I'm very excited to go into that and dig into that. But can you quickly kind of give a background to your education, anything else that could be pertinent to why you got into looking at females in academia and sports and all that other stuff?
For sure. So I will start with a bit of my sport background because that is ultimately what led me to the career path that I've chosen. I grew up in a small town and I had the opportunity to play a lot of different sports. They were kind of like you have to play, otherwise, we don't have a team, that kind of small town.
Yeah. Okay.
And I ended up playing volleyball and softball a little bit more competitively. And I found in that shift of becoming a more competitive athlete, there was a lack of resources to support the more pressure, higher expectations, and the sense of isolation that you end up feeling when I was like plucked out and I was one of a handful of girls that would end up playing more competitive sport. And there were challenges like not feeling like I didn't belong on the team, being frustrated with my performance because the coaches are it wasn't coming from the coaches. It was definitely a perceived pressure and perceived performance expectations on my part. And there was also a lot of bullying where girls would make comments about like, oh, like you think you're so much better than us because you're going to play higher level sports. And it's like, I was invited. I'm just trying to have a good time and you're being mean to me. So there was a variety of challenges that came up. And I found when I was a young athlete, I often had men, well, my one woman coach got like, bless her, she created a safe space for me. But when I got more competitive, I had a couple of male coaches, and the philosophy was basically like go cry behind the bench, and when you're ready, you can come back. And so that was a little bit about my like the challenges I faced as an athlete. And come high school graduation, I got accepted into that is that cat. So come high school graduation, I got accepted into the College of Kinesiology at the University of Saskatchewan. And this small, intimate grad ceremony, we had the opportunity to share what we wanted to do in the future, what we planned on pursuing. And I was like, I don't know, what can I do with a kinesiology degree? So I got
Very
got
fair.
on got on Google, and this idea of sports psychology and mental performance training came up, and I was just like, that's what I'm going to put that on my grad slideshow because that sounds cool, but also like that also sounds really cool, and why not? So throughout I just kind of gritted out my undergrad and I wasn't really sure what next steps would be. I kind of had this vague idea that I wanted to support young women athletes, but didn't have a concrete plan of what that was going to look like. So in the fourth year of my undergrad, I got connected with my wonderful supervisor, Dr. Kent Kowalski. He does a ton of research in the area of self-compassion now. And I got connected with him as a fourth year student, and I completed in my honors program with his supervision. And I was like, hey, I guess I need a master's degree if I want to get the required certification to be a mental performance consultant. So I guess a master's degree is the next step. Hey, Kent, do you want to supervise a master's degree? And he was like, sure, let's just keep doing this thing. And so I did my master's degree with Kent. After I finished my master's degree in 2020, I took a couple of years off. I seeked out a few different PhD opportunities, but I was like, it's an opportunity, but I don't know if it's what I want to do right now. And nothing ever came of any of those initial conversations. Then in 2021, I got an email from my current supervisor, Dr. Leah Ferguson. She's also fabulous and does a ton of research in the area of self compassion. And she said, hey, I have this grant. Take a read through it. If you're up for doing this project, I want you to be the one to do it. And so I took a read through it and I was like, could not think of a better project for me to hop onto. It's very applied. So I said yes, and now I'm in my third year of my PhD. So that's my story. I'm not sure if you have any questions about it or want to follow up on any parts of it.
Yeah, tons of questions. But the interesting thing, a couple things that you touched on. One that's more salient now is the idea that you had really good mentorship from the very beginning, and you kind of had an idea of like what you wanted to go into. And what I've seen in grad school programs a lot of times is there's a lot of students that don't know what they want to do, and then they kind of get like roped into like, hey, you should do this type of research because it's fun, and then they get into it and they're like, well, this is not fun at all, and then they're like, but I'm stuck because I've already committed to this. So that could be a whole tangent on like bad mentorship, but it sounds like you had really good mentorship, and they've been able to really hone in your skills on what you wanted to do. And you talked about compassion as part of the structure of your research. Can you kind of quickly define what compassion research is, and what are some of the like sex differences that you found within compassion research, if you have found any?
Okay, so compassion, I don't know a ton about compassion specifically. What I do know and how it's been taught to me is that compassion comes from a very Eastern Buddhist philosophy. Compassion is the motivation we have to ease suffering. When we think about Eastern Buddhist philosophy, we are just part of the bubble of suffering that we are trying to ease. When we Kristen Neff is somebody who pioneered the concept of self compassion, and she's one of the primary researchers whose work I follow. And self compassion is more so just the intentional, well, what's the difference between self compassion and mindful self compassion as well? But mindful self compassion is the intentional practice of turning the motivation we feel to get rid of suffering towards ourselves. So one something that's come up in some of the data analysis that I'm doing right now, and I don't know if this is going to be a final result, but it's just really sticking in my brain, is that being self-compassionate is about fighting for ourselves instead of with ourselves. So often we make our lives harder than they need to be by being hard on ourselves. And self-compassion is basically saying, like, instead of directing the fight inwards, we direct the fight outwards. And what's the next action we're going to take, and how are we going to improve instead of dwelling and ruminating on our suffering? So self-compassion has three components: mindfulness, self-compassion, and common humanity. Mindfulness, common term that's frequently used and sometimes misconstrued, I think, by the general population or by pop psych and what's easily accessible in books, where mindfulness is being in the present moment. It's not trying to change or adjust anything. And sometimes that gets misconstrued with feeling good. Mindfulness is sometimes taught as a stress reliever. So if we're relieved of stress, we must be feeling great. But mindfulness is actually just not making our stress and anxiety and worries more intense than they need to be. So mindfulness is saying, I'm feeling anxious, and that's okay, rather than saying, I'm feeling anxious and I need to get rid of this anxiety. So, and then that often amplifies your anxiety because you're resisting it so much. So that's mindfulness in a nutshell. Definitely doesn't do it justice to what the concept and what the experience is to be mindful as a whole. If I'm like there, I remember having one experience where I was going for a walk and engaging in your five senses. I like to say we have seven senses because we also feel emotions and we feel our physical body moving. So I like to add those two senses on top of our traditional five senses. But if you can engage with all of your senses, is a really powerful way to practice mindfulness. And I remember having this one experience where I was walking to school and just like watching how the trees moved against the sky and how the sky was moving slower than the trees. And it was just like this like really magical experience. And that's mindfulness of a moment. When we talk about mindfulness of emotions, it's really tapping into those body sensations. And it's really fascinating to be able to say, I'm trying to think of something that's come up for me recently. Like, what's an intense emotion? Something that is like if I'm talking about a difficult experience with my family, my back starts to bother me.
Yeah.
And like we have all these physical sensations come up, and mindfulness is saying like I'm feeling anxious about this thing, and as I'm feeling anxious and talking about this thing, I'm also feeling my body react, and part of my anxiousness is actually this tension in my back. And it's mindfulness is really fascinating and often misconstrued. So it's not trying to
Yeah.
get rid of an emotion, it's just fully experiencing it for all that it is and not trying to fight it or get rid of it.
Yeah. No,
And
that
then
That's
go
really
ahead.
interesting because, like, in when looking at like some of the research in mindfulness in people with depression and anxiety, a lot of it is centered around pulling yourself out of your mind and into your body to help get rid of some of the intrusive thoughts, some of the rumination. And they found that when you compare that to meditation, that seems to be more helpful because with meditation, you stay in your mind, you stay present within your mind, and you're thinking about your thoughts. Whereas mindfulness, they want you to be more thinking about your body, and that takes you out of your mind. But you're kind of saying that the way that you guys are defining mindfulness is more of a acceptance of what's in your mind and an acknowledgement of what's in your mind, and not necessarily distracting yourself with what's in your body unless you create awareness to it, or like if you feel it, right? You're not actively trying to pull yourself out of your mind is what it sounds like you guys are defining it as. And obviously like with every research group, they create different definitions for everything, and that's where things can get a little muddy of like what are we actually talking about. So the way that you defined it is perfect. But there might be some people that read research on mindfulness and they see that, oh, this is clearly just taking your mind out of your, like taking your thoughts out of your mind and putting it into your body, which it could be that, but it sounds like yours is a little bit more immersive.
Yeah, I want to say it's both. I don't think it's one or the other. And I think it's really about finding a mindfulness practice and strategy that works for you. And we can sometimes, if we're spending a lot of time up in our head, we miss what's going on in our body.
Mhm.
That's why I say it's both. Like
Yeah.
both go on at the same time. We just tend to be very disconnected and live from the shoulders up, especially as academics. Stress headaches are, I'm very good at giving myself those because all of my energy is just up here all the time.
Mhm.
But yeah, mindfulness is both, and it's an awareness of an entire experience. And I think so. In addition, so there's mindfulness, self kindness, common humanity. Neff also describes self compassion as having the opposite of kind of like what self compassion isn't. And so the opposite of mindfulness, Neff describes as over identification. Over identification is that tendency to dwell and ruminate on difficulties. And that's where we often make our lives harder than they need to be. Where something that I'm going to say this because it's a podcast and this isn't getting peer reviewed, but something that I think Kristen Neff's language sometimes misses is that avoidance can also happen. Like we can go to the extreme end of really dwelling and sitting in the hard stuff, or we could go to the far end and keep ourselves busy and pretend that everything is fine and dandy when actually our body is freaking out.
Yeah.
We're just choosing not to pay attention to it. So avoidance is also a thing. And mindfulness is sitting in the middle where we're saying, oh, actually, this stuff is hard, but I'm not dwelling on it so much that it's becoming a distraction from me being able to function.
Yeah. No, it's the use of avoidance is interesting because like you have distraction, which could be seen as avoidance, but they're not the same thing because we like when you look at the research on distraction, that can be something that's productive when the intensity of a stimulus is very high, like, oh, I'm having these anxious thoughts or I'm very depressed, and I can distract myself by going to do exercise, and then you kind of get out of those thoughts, and then you get all those feel good things of exercise. So then you get like, oh well, this distraction was good, whereas like avoidance is like, I'm just going to completely ignore it and distract and not actually do anything. It's not like a proactive thing, it's more of a reactive thing.
Yeah, or like productive. And I think what I heard you describe is like you temper your engagement in the thoughts with physically getting into your body. I know you used exercise as an example, but that's kind of how we can use our breath to get into our body. When our mind feels really intense, you use your breath as an anchor. Maybe it's using exercise as an opportunity to be like, okay, wait, how is my body actually feeling? And I don't actually have to be stuck on this hamster wheel that's in my head. So I think it's neat that you use exercise as the example of the distraction, but your distraction could be, I mean, let's be real. I love watching a good TV show, or it could be a hobby. And like there's so many different ways that you can distract yourself from the intensity of it. And then when you have a little bit more space and are feeling a little bit less activated, it's a lot easier to sit with in a way that is more balanced.
Yeah. No,
Balance is sometimes language of mindfulness.
yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's also like it's a choice that you're actively making to like I feel this and now I can make the choice to overcome this because if I don't, I'm going to sit with it and then it's just going to manifest, manifest, manifest. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's like a lot of these things that you're talking about are like actions. They're more verb oriented than noun oriented as far as like descriptors go. And I think having that choice of what you're doing, what you're putting yourself in is something that people that suffer with like mental health disorders or low self-esteem, they oftentimes feel like they don't have a choice in the matter. They don't feel like they have the opportunity to choose the things that happen in their life, more that life happens to them. So the fact that they're choosing to watch TV or choosing to exercise or choosing to focus on their breath, I think that initial thought of I'm choosing this helps to create this infrastructure of like, yeah, I'm in control. And once I have control, then my body starts to calm down. And maybe today's control is TV, maybe tomorrow's control is exercise, but like I have all these tools to take control of it.
I think that idea of like intentional choice is huge.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that language. So yeah,
Yeah.
that was just yeah, that's the sneak peek of mindfulness. And something else that's kind of coming up that comes up with mindfulness is the idea of non-judgment. So the second part of self-compassion or Neff's framework of self-compassion is self-kindness. The opposite of that being not self-judgment.
Yeah.
So part of mindfulness is a non-judgmental, neutral awareness. And that really ties in closely with this concept of self-kindness, where this is the most self-explanatory part of self-compassion, where it's just like, can we stop being so mean to ourselves? Like, how about just for a second we stop bullying ourselves and actually see some of the like beauty that we all have inside of us? And something that so something that came out of my honors research, a whole 3 participants worth of data, but I do want to dig a little bit more into this in my PhD work, was that it might not, oh, this came up, no, that's a lie. This came up in my master's research. So then that, which is published. So this is actually legit knowledge where it wasn't so much that athletes like needed to be kind and nurturing to themselves all the time,
Mhm.
but can we at least get to a space where we're neutral?
Yeah.
Like we don't always need like you're so wonderful and you're fantastic and like let's be fabulous and always be encouraging ourselves, but can we at least stop beating ourselves up long enough to take the next step?
Yeah. No,
Is
that
a big
that makes
thing.
a lot of sense. And when you say that, something that resonates with me, and maybe I'd like to get your thoughts on this is Susan. I think Suzanne Davis or Suzanne David. She wrote a book on emotions, and part of it is like we don't want to define ourselves by our emotions, right? We don't want to. Part of self kindness is like, or self compassion, and all those things is like we don't want to say I'm a sad person. We want to say like today I feel sad, right? As opposed to just giving that adjective to define who you are, you're kind of using it to define how you feel at that present moment. Is that something that kind of somewhat correlates to this idea of like being more compassionate with yourself, being more kind with yourself? Like the words we use to define who we are can play a huge role. So if like I define myself as I'm a loser because I struck out, in 2 at bats, and therefore now I'm always going to be a loser. And if I do hit the ball the next time, that was luck, that wasn't ability, right? Those words that we use to define us is something that I think is very powerful. And I didn't know if that was a correlates to what you're kind of talking about.
Yeah, so I've heard this idea that if we can separate our identity from the emotion, it makes the emotion less powerful. Anecdotally, I I hesitate to fully accept that idea,
Yeah.
but to each their own. If it works for you, it works for you. Something that I what I was taught is that emotions aren't facts. So the idea of just because you feel like a loser in this moment, really it's a story because you don't loser isn't a feeling. You feel disappointed. If you have this story that you are a loser, you are going to, like, the story just ends up repeating. But one example that I use is, I'm disappointed.
Mhm.
I'm so disappointed in myself, therefore I must be a disappointment.
Yeah.
And I do think that they're like taking that emotion of, I feel disappointed, therefore I must be a disappointment, taking that emotion and trying to make a fact out of it, or trying to make that part of your identity, is often where challenges come in. So if athletes can have the awareness to say, like, oh, maybe it's I'm disappointed because I really cared about this,
Yeah.
that's a different thing. And I think just the story behind the emotion is the important part, and it's not the emotion itself. Or identifying as a sad person isn't a bad thing. People are allowed to be sad people. That's fine. But if it's also sort of, I often use the metaphor of like stoking the fire. So if we're stoking the fire with stories about how we are a loser and how we are a disappointment and how shameful it is to have failed at all of these things, then your sadness is going to be a lot more intense.
Yeah.
Sadness is just a feeling. The story is what makes the feeling consistent.
Yeah, no, I mean that makes a lot of sense. Are you have you looked at sex differences in terms of this goes? Because I know the research shows that female athletes, female participants in research are more they pay more attention, they have a more attentional biases towards negative stimuli. So therefore, their stories that they create are going to be focused more on negativity. But what they found in the research is that if you can put them through an exercise intervention, that helps improve their valence towards less negative things and their attention towards less negative things, and it can shift towards seeing positive things a little bit better. So I didn't know if that maybe if you saw male counterparts being less harmful to the way they describe themselves, and maybe the females are going to be a little bit more hard on themselves.
Yeah, so I haven't done a ton of work specifically on gender differences. We use the language of gender just because we are a very social, because we are a social science, we use gender as language. And I primarily do research with women athletes. So I'm very familiar with the literature on women athletes, and I'm not super familiar on literature that separates the two of them. So there's a
Okay.
lot of, I think it's so fascinating that, like, I've never heard that women have the tendency for a stronger negativity bias.
Mhm.
I find it fascinating. And in just like anecdotally, when I read a paper about women athletes talking about challenges versus a paper where men athletes are talking about challenges, I haven't done any formal analysis on this, but it just feels like they talk about their challenges in a different way. Where when women athletes talk about challenges, they feel very grand. But when men athletes talk about challenges, it's a lot more neutral. Like we talked about mindfulness, and they're a lot more mindful of just like, yeah, it's hard sometimes and you figure it out. Whereas women athletes are like, no, this is hard.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, that's just me reading these articles, and it could just be a difference between the author's voice and how they've chosen to write these articles. But yeah, so I don't know a ton about
Yeah.
gender differences or sex differences, depending
Fine.
on which.
You sound like my friend Olivia Anderson. She's doing her PhD. She's graduating this semester, and she was I think she was doing her dissertation proposal, or she was doing something along those lines. And one of the questions was asked was like, "Oh, are you comparing this to males?" And she's like, no, like males have enough research. I'm just focused on women. I only care about women. I want to start pushing that research. So I get it 100% that that's a much needed area of interest. And if you're solely focused on that and the complexities of that, like who cares about the other stuff? Like that's for another PhD person to figure out, right? You can only focus on one thing at a time. So I get that. I like that. I think the idea of comparisons between genders is something that is interesting, but like, what does it really tell us? Other than maybe if like you're, especially in sports, because you don't coach them, like you're not coaching them at the same, like there's no co-ed. So you don't really have to like, maybe as a strength trainer, it'd be important to know gender differences because obviously women have a tendency to recover faster in exercise because they're more slow twitch dominant. So you'd have to change their rest periods to get the same training adaptations and things like
I'm
that.
learning so much.
Yeah, I mean, no, me too. Me too. Yeah. So you have to like train them differently in a sense of like what adaptation you want out of them because they're going to be more slow twitch dominant. So they have higher endurance capacity, which means they also can deliver oxygen and blood to the muscles faster, so they recover a lot faster. And there's a bunch of dynamics like that. But I think it's good. Needless to say, long tangent short, I think it's good to just focus on females and give them all the attention they need to come up with the research to catch up to all the male research that dominated the field for the last 50 years. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and I think there is still value in gender comparisons. I do think we need research where we can more clearly understand how men and women show up differently in sport and the nuanced challenges that one group faces where the other doesn't. Sorry. Um but yeah, just not my particular
Yeah,
area.
exactly. You can't know everything about everything, right?
That's for another PhD student
Yeah.
to worry about. I have the same. I'm very much like I was reading a lot of feminist research and a lot of stats about the level of research for on women in sport. And I got so fired up, I could not write my dissertation. I was like, I cannot write it because all of this angers me so much. So
And
that's where I'm at.
it's a fair feeling of anger because especially when you look at like the reasons why research was not done on females is so like ego male centric to where it was like they're just too difficult to study, so we're not going to study them. And it's like, great, that's really practical. Like that's the way you do research. Is like it's too difficult. I'm just going to go with the easy stuff. It's like what a cop out, right?
Right? And it's like, oh, that's difficult. How about you ask some more questions about it? And I read something else about because there was like some misinformation, like this is like back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, about how high intensity sport wasn't good for women and how it would cause hysteria. And what triggered that was something to do with a woman's tennis match got a higher audience, made more money than the men. So the men were like, well, I guess women aren't allowed to play anymore. This is, I can't remember what this was about, and I could be totally wrong. So, like, nobody take this as fact. But this idea of, like, okay, so women were crushing it. And then the men were like, absolutely not. We're going to decide. We make the
Yep.
rules. None for you.
That sounds about right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've come a long way since then. Still got a long way to go, and
Thank
that's
goodness.
where your job is ever so important. But yeah, I distracted you on a dumb bunch of different tangents. We're on to the third part of the compassion piece. So we talked about
Yeah.
self compassion. We talked about um, the kindness, and then if you want to go into the kindness more, we can go into that more. You can go on to the third piece.
Yeah, I don't know if the self-kindness feels so much more self-explanatory than the other one. So I will jump into common humanity and then I can chat more globally about self-compassion if that's where we end up going. I love a good tangent, so that's okay too. But yeah, the final component is common humanity, with the opposite of common humanity being isolation. Common humanity is this idea that we're part of being human is to feel pain. Things are not going to be glorious and fabulous all of the time. We are going to go through hard stuff. And some just having that awareness is a way to maintain perspective when you are going through a challenge. And the there was what else about common humanity? Oh, something else that came to mind recently. So I went on a self-compassion retreat back in 2018, and learning about common humanity fascinated me because I grew up in a household that was very self-centered and a lot of self-pity. So it was very much like, oh, I have a hard life and my life is the hardest, and like
Mhm.
life's not a suffer off, I think, is one thing. We are all suffering, and suffering is relative to our past experiences, so everybody's hard is different. And so yeah, those are just a few ideas that I wanted to share. This like, being that I grew up in this household of like pity, where like poor me and I'm the only one who has a hard time, realizing that everybody goes through hard things, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Like, even the most privileged person goes through hard things. crazy. I never would have thought.
Right?
And so then, yeah, so I'm really just like flabbergasted by this concept of common humanity. And I had this, so the way Neff talks about it is that we are all flawed, we all have weaknesses, we all fail at different things. And something that has come up for me recently is like, are we flawed? Or
Mm,
are these all just things?
yeah, because
No,
flaw is being compared to normal, and then who gets to determine what normal is? As like human
yeah,
beings are just messy, like that, like we're all just messy.
but that's normal. And so when we use this language of flawed, weak, inadequate, messy, is that not then putting a judgment on what this human existence is? Anyway, so I had this thought, and I know that people like it makes sense for people because people connect with this idea of a negative story, this negative story we have about ourselves. So I get why they use that language. But at the same time, it's like, are we not also just perpetuating these stories we have? And I think that this is where the translation from Eastern philosophy is very much like everything just is. And then Neff is like, everything is weakness and flaws and inadequacy because that's what we identify with. So like I get it. The opposite of common humanity is isolation. And that's kind of what I talked about with the self-pity thing. So a lot of people misconstrue self-compassion with self-pity, where the difference is this connection to a larger humanity. And it really makes it a lot easier not to dwell quite so much on your hardships. But isolation is this idea that it's only me and I'm the only person going through a hard time. And then sometimes when we get in that headspace, we actually disconnect ourselves more from the people who are around. So it becomes this like self-fulfilling prophecy. And or not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but this downward spiral of like I am suffering and I'm the only one who suffers, therefore it doesn't feel safe to connect with other people right now because they are not going to be able to understand my suffering. So I'm just going to continue to distance myself. And then it creates a greater sense of isolation because you're not able to connect with people. So that's a little bit about common humanity.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because all these principles are definitely foundationally built through Buddhism, and they had it right thousands of years ago, and now we're finally coming to the idea of like, yeah, let's quantify it, let's study it, and you're like, wow, they did have it right. And it's like how did they get it right? We have all the technology and science in the world, and we're still muddling through it, and like they figured it out so many thousands of years ago.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's amazing.
I know. I
Yeah,
love it.
I love it too. I love it too. um One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was this idea of mental female performance in sports. And one of the things that came to mind was, building confidence. How can we facilitate that? How can we start to shift these mindsets, create better self talk strategies? How can we, like, what are some practical strategies of how to do that? So the idea is like building confidence in female athletes through the mental side of it. What are some of the things that you're really focused on in this area that we're seeing that we can start to utilize to help build this up?
Okay, confidence is something that I've been very focused on in the last week. This is fresh, so fabulous topic. So when I have chatted with athletes about confidence more recently, I've been leaning on a lot of Albert Bandura's self-efficacy work, where self-efficacy is like a domain-specific confidence. And I don't sometimes I introduce the word self-efficacy and how it's different, but I also being that I work with young women, will introduce some of these like big concepts as like, are you ready to learn a fancy word? We're going to learn a fancy word, but then really try to bring it down to their level and like, what is language that's going to make sense for them? So I'll explain that, but then we use the more global word of confidence. And so number one, we become more efficacious when we have positive past experiences with a task at hand. So I basically frame this as, have you done it well before? That's your biggest source of confidence. However, and I'm going to stack these as like, I'll go through these four things and I'll offer a practice for each of them. The challenge is we do things well and we don't give ourselves credit for it. So, something that I have the athletes I work with do is make a success list of or like I'll get them to do this bit of a guided imagery and say like create a highlight reel of all of the moments you've enjoyed over this past season, or maybe it's over the last 4 years, or it just kind of depends on who I'm working with. So do this bit of an imagery, create a highlight reel. What are all those moments that stand out? They could be glimmers, just things that you enjoyed, moments where you're like, whoa, I grew, or moments where you're like, this is hard right now, but I'm going to keep showing up because I'm working towards goals. And then like make this list. And it doesn't have to be the grand personal best, getting a certain rank, going to a certain competition, but what are those small day-to-day things that you did to show up where you are today? And have you ever given yourself credit for that? Most people in the room are like, no, because this is just what's expected of me. And I'm like, yeah, and you still do it. So, like, one of my favorite things is like, if I have a room full of athletes that are separated into tables, they end up like sharing with their table and then share with the room about what happened at their table and or the conversation at their table. And as we go around the room, it's like, okay, thank you, amazing, love this, like snaps for you. And we go around the room and everybody gets snaps and it feels so cheesy and cringy. And it's fun. And like, it's the smallest thing that you can do. And it doesn't have to be a grand celebration, but as long as you're bringing that energy of like, nice to whatever it is that you're doing. It could be a bubble bath. I love to bake as a celebration. Like I bake all the time, but sometimes I make a batch of celebration cookies. And, or maybe it's like sitting and watching a TV show being like, I'm watching this and good for me because I crushed it today. You know, like it can be the most mundane task that you're bringing this energy of like, look at what I'm doing well,
Yeah.
really acknowledging it. So big thing, confidence comes from past experiences. Past success is a big contributor to confidence, but you need to actually acknowledge that success has happened. Celebrating it is just like a nice addition. So the
Yeah.
second part to Bandura's self-efficacy theory is vicarious experience. So watching other people do well can often be motivating for us. The challenge is in sport, it's a very competitive space. So seeing somebody else do well is often like, don't like that. That's a threat. Now I have to be better than them. And so I really try to encourage athletes to see other people's success as inspiration. We all have our unique set of qualities and strengths, and you will never be a carbon copy of another athlete, but can you use their success as inspiration? This is especially valuable for young women who like maybe you're working with a young volleyball player who sees somebody who's 4 years ahead of them and is like, wow, I want to be as good as them. Or, you know, maybe you're working with an athlete who is the older girl on the team, but has the least amount of years in the sport. So there's this pressure of like, oh, well, I need to be better than them because I'm older than them. When it's like, how about we just be inspired by like, in 3 years, you could be where they're at. And how fantastic is that? So I really try to reframe seeing others as a threat to seeing others as inspiration. I very much go against traditional sport culture in a lot of what I teach athletes, but I think if we're prioritizing well-being, we have to create a new culture in sport. So that's two. And number three is encouraging words or verbal persuasion, I think is maybe the language Bandura uses. But the fact I'm like, it just means people say nice things about you.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
all. You know,
Yeah.
like let's make this simple for the kids and me. Like, so when I talk about the encouraging words, I really try to get athletes to realize how much they lean on their coach for encouragement. Like we love to hear people say good things about us.
Hmm.
But at the same time, does somebody ever give you a compliment and you're like, thanks, but no thanks? Thanks, but that compliment may be uncomfortable. So we're not actually fully receiving it. Like we're so thirsty for it. And then when we get it, we're like, I'll just take a sip.
Yeah.
And it's like, let that soak in. We have these like intense stories about who we are that when we do get a positive story, we can't even accept it because we're so full of these stories that aren't helpful. And so I really try to call that to athletes' attention of like next time a teammate or a coach says something nice about you, believe it.
Yeah.
And Stop waiting for them to say it. Start saying it to yourself. So Kristen Neff has this one practice called, she has a few different versions of it, but it's something about a compassionate friend, where she has you visualize sitting in a safe space and getting really comfy and cozy, and then you invite a friend in. And this friend is wise and all-knowing, and they know exactly what to say all of the time. And it's just sitting with them. And sometimes I provide additional context to say, like, they say exactly what you need heading into this competition. Like, what is that pep talk they're giving you? So sometimes I'll add some contextual details like that. But what I, as the meditation closes, like part of the closing statements is, this voice is always there.
Mm.
You can always connect to that voice. You just got to slow down and do it. And like until it becomes more natural and more normal. So the wise compassionate friend is one that I've done to help athletes connect with their own kind inner voice. And I think if we can work on accepting compliments and kind words from others, as well as nurture that kindness in ourselves, that's really connecting to the encouraging words part of Bandura's theory. And again, all of these are connected, or not again, but all of these are connected. This is just how my brain silos them as a consultant who works with athletes. And then the fourth one is body sensations. The fourth part of confidence is the physiological response. And I'm sure he uses different words. I could never remember this fourth piece. I just knew it was like, how does it feel in your body?
Yeah.
So when we talked about body sensations earlier, so this is beautiful, full circle moment here, but like, can you remember a time that you felt confident? And like, you can do a little bit of imagery to create this picture in your mind of that moment where you're like feeling like a powerhouse, you're unstoppable, you're on top of the world. And how does it feel in your body? Like, there's a bit of activation, but there's also a sense of calm and trusting. And like, maybe it's like, if it's like anger activation might be this fiery red color, but maybe your confident activation is like this really soft pink color. I'm thinking like cotton candy, floating clouds, like sunset clouds. And really getting to connect with, what does that energy of confidence even feel like? And I often like to bring in the concept of power posing into this part too, where we can hold our body in a certain position. Again, I don't know a ton about the literature on power posing, but I know our bodies and minds are connected. So again, if it works for somebody, it works for somebody, and that's all that matters. And if you can get them to stand in like the Wonder Woman pose and like hands out, I love like the hands out to the side, just like I'm holding the world in my hands, as a way to connect to like, what does that fiery, fierce, confident, unstoppable energy even feel like?
Mm.
And I think if we can work on seeing our own past success and celebrating it, if we can work on, what was the second one? Vicarious experience, seeing other people as inspiration rather than as a threat, creating our own inner voice of encouragement, and then really actually understanding what it means to feel confident. Like, we're just tackling confidence from a few different angles. So
Yeah.
that's the conversation I've been having with athletes a lot, and 4 of the practices that I walk athletes through. So
Yeah.
follow-up questions. What you got for me?
Fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. Of course. Of course. So it's interesting because the dynamics of sports is totally different than the dynamics of human day-to-day interaction. So one of the things you were talking about is like, we don't give ourselves enough credit. And I think that that's true in sports. But then when you think about like human nature and human behavior, it's very much the opposite. And the thing that I'm thinking of is, you'll hear all these people say, why don't you just exercise? Why don't you just eat better? Like, why you lack discipline, you're lazy. I can do it. Why can't you do it? Right. So we say to ourselves, like, I can do it. I have all the confidence I can do it. So why can't you do it? And if you can't do it, but I can, therefore you're lazy, as opposed to maybe that person has messed up hunger hormones. Maybe that person has more fat adiposity from childhood. Maybe these things are out of their control. Maybe they're not lazy. Maybe they actually are disciplined. Right. But we give ourselves this credit. And when I think about that, I think about like determinism as well. Robert Sapolsky talks about this idea that we manifest this sense of accomplishment in terms of like oh, I made it through the PhD, right? So I'm a hard worker. I'm really smart. I'm all these things. And in his mind, it's like, well, no, you're not. You're lucky because you're born into these things and these things shaped your life. So we do tend to give ourselves a lot of credit for a lot of our accomplishments. And then we tend to minimize other people when they can't do what we do instead of being like, I'm just lucky that I got here. So when you say that in athletes, it does resonate with me that we are athletes are much harder on themselves than anyone else. But I think humans in general, we have this tendency to think like, I'm here because I worked so hard to get here. And if you don't work hard, you're not going to ever make it to where I am. That type of deal, right?
And I think that that is just perpetuating the egotistical culture that we live in of like, I'm harder working for you, therefore that is why I'm more successful. So they really attribute it to their own personal qualities.
Yeah.
When, like you said, the fact is life lined you up to get to where you are. And just because you're here right now doesn't mean in 10 years things aren't going to flip. And hard work, yes, it's a good and valuable thing, but that is not the only reason why people are successful. And I've recently thought about this idea of being lazy and undisciplined. And it's like, are you lazy and undisciplined? Or does somebody just not have access to resources? Or do they lack clarity of what they're working towards? Do they not see value in movement just because that's the example that we're talking about? Or do they not even know where to start? Like,
Yeah.
is just going for a walk good enough? I don't know, because Instagram tells me it's not. So
Right.
then, like, we end up getting stuck in these stories about why we're not good enough. And regardless, it's all based in judgment of me thinking I'm better than you because I did X, Y, Z, or me thinking I don't have the skills to do this because I'm not going to do it perfectly or the way I feel like it should be done. And it's all just full of judgment and expectations.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think sports is one of those unique things where it's like fully meritocracy based for the most part. There is obviously going to be some nepotism, some other stuff that goes on in sports, but for the most part, it is meritocracy based. And when you grow up in a culture that is valued for the athlete that you are, you're always going to be very self critical. But when you grow up in a culture where it's like you're not really that self critical, it's very easy to be like, I'm going to point down at you because I know that I manifested this work ethic that I built for my like it's just so weird. And I think that's why sports is so great because it does like it puts that pressure on you to like think about these things, and work towards something as opposed to just think like, you know, I'm the best. It's nice to be humbled sometimes.
Yeah, and I think like that is one thing that when you're challenged, you definitely get humbled. At the same time, being able to recognize that you persevere is
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's definitely a balance, and I very much live in the world of like we're all just on our own little journeys, and your
Yeah.
journey is no better than mine. Like me, some that kind of like I really resonate with that story you told because people will be like, "Oh, you're doing a PhD, you're so smart." I'm like, "No, I just really learned how to study and research is cool." And like, I just learned the skills to get here.
Yeah.
And like, if you wanted to, you could figure it out too. But if you
Yeah.
don't want to, that's cool. Do your own thing. I
Right.
don't care.
I got lucky enough to find something that I love that makes work not feel hard. So then I love to work and like I understand how lucky I am. You might be in a PhD where you don't like it and therefore you don't want to work hard. And therefore some people are going to perceive that you're lazy. It's like, well, no, you just didn't get as lucky as I did by getting into the right spot that you just fell in love with, right? It's like
Yeah.
I think luck plays a big part of it, and I just don't. I think people give themselves more credit than they give credit to luck a lot of times, and I understand why. It makes you feel like you're in control of your life and you're doing the things that you want, and I see the value in that. I just don't see the value in like tearing other people down to make you feel better as well, and I think that happens a lot.
Ooh, that reminds me. So, a word that you used earlier was self esteem.
Hmm.
And self esteem is what a lot of the early research in self compassion was like, well, we need self esteem was the gold standard.
Yeah.
And in order to see self compassion as valid, we need to prove that it is doing more than self esteem. So much of self esteem is about the comparison game. Who's
Yeah.
doing better? Who's doing better or worse? And the idea that we put judgments on certain things is what makes something better or less than. But then we can only ever feel as good as our comparison group. So
Hmm.
if I'm the high performer, in in quotes in my friend group where I'm going to post secondary school and my other friends are working their corporate jobs, whatever, then I'm like, okay, look at me, all hoity toity. I don't actually think this. Look at just like putting it out there. Maybe we do use a sport example where it's quite a little bit less personal, but like you have one student, you have one university student who is varsity, like a varsity athlete compared to like an engineer student. Everybody's like, oh, varsity athlete, because look at you playing sports and doing all this wonderful stuff. And like, there's so much value when my friend sometimes frames it as the social capital you get from playing sports is just bonkers. And so then everybody in society, and this athlete included, is like, oh, I'm so much better than you. And look at how, because I am playing sports and doing all the successful stuff, and you're just in engineering or whatever that other college might be, and you're not nearly as good as me because you're not even a student athlete. And it's like, okay, well, you picked that. Good for you. And they picked this, and good for them. And like, what about then there might be another situation where it's like, okay, well, what about when this engineer wins this certain award and you're just over here, not just over here playing sports, but like, and it's like, as long as we're playing a comparison game, we're going to be miserable.
Yeah.
Miserable deep down because it really makes it hard to connect with people. And like, you might feel good because you're constantly telling yourself that everybody's less than you, but it's going to be really hard to find connections in life. And we are very social creatures. So like, good luck when you have the story that everybody is doing worse than you for
Yeah.
some reason or another. It's so easy to create a story of they're doing worse than me, but it's so often because we're insecure about the thing we're doing. We're
Yeah.
like, if I create a story that they're doing worse, then I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
But so much of that is fueled by insecurity. So even though it comes across as this like macho, ooh, look at me, I'm so fabulous, it's so often fueled by an insecurity of not being enough.
Yeah. No, they say the loudest person in the room is always the most insecure, and that rings true in human nature. But again, this is coming back to like one of the things you said within sports. There's a bit of a contradiction, right? Because one of the things you were talking about is like watch others to quote unquote compare to strive towards them, right? So you are looking at them and saying like, oh, this is what I could be, right? You can compare yourself to other people and say like, oh yeah, they're successful, but they're no different than me. So if they can be successful, I can be successful. I think it's like the tone of how you compare and who you compare yourself to. Like one of the things we know with goal setting is that if the goal is so extreme that it doesn't seem like you're ever going to reach it, maybe that'll beat you down. So if you are in basketball and you're in college basketball, maybe you'll compare yourself to the best player on your team. But if you compare yourself to the best player to ever do it, which is Michael Jordan, no debate about it. Michael Jordan is the absolute best. I got all the stats to prove it. That might be something that like makes you be like, well, I'm never going to be that good. So like, why should I try? So have you found like there's a sweet spot of like maybe how far you want to reach when you're trying to compare yourself to someone in order for you to actually get there so it doesn't destroy like your confidence and your motivation to continue on?
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating question. And I don't know if there's a way to measure it. Again, I'm not in the self-esteem or social comparison world, but I think a lot of it is like, one, how far down the road are you looking?
Yeah.
Like if you're first year university student and you're like, in 4 years I want to be the best NBA player there ever was. No, like you have an entire NBA career to play before you get there. And so I think the timeline of when you think that goal is actually going to come to fruition plays a role. And so much of it is just tempering of like, sometimes day to day, you need to look at somebody different for that inspiration because something might feel like too much or not enough as motivation. And a lot of it comes down to the self awareness. And this is, again, listening to body sensations of like, when I look at the fourth year, if I'm in my first year and I look at that fourth year player on my team and I'm like, wow, they're so good. I want to be as consistent as them one day, or I want to be able to make these shots like them one day. Some days that might feel motivating,
Mm-hmm.
and some days that might feel overwhelming. And so on days where you need the motivation, maybe you look to that person and think, yes, that's what I'm going for. And on days where you're feeling overwhelmed by the process, maybe it's a matter of reminding yourself that like, hey, actually, you're good where you're at.
Yeah.
And that comes down to self-awareness
Yeah.
and being able to the um, temper the not even quite comparison, but the social aspect and how we lean on other people to measure where we're at.
Hmm.
I think that's a big part of it. A lot of people just think it's all or nothing of like, I either really need to push to be like them, or I'm worthless.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, some days you need the push and some days you need some grace.
Yeah.
Welcome to being human.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
It's so
For sure.
gray.
Yeah. Yeah. And tell me what you think about this. Like the athletes that I work with, I'll tell them something similar to this. I'll tell them, look at, I deal with a lot of strength athletes, so powerlifters, strongmen, things like that. And I say, okay, instead of comparing yourself to the best powerlifter that you want to get to, how about pick like 10 of the best powerlifters and think about like what are they doing to be the best? Not like what are their genetics allowing them to, but like what are their day-to-day tasks that they're doing to be the best, right? So if you're on the bench, I would tell that person like, look at the starters, look at what they do day to day. What can you do like what are you not doing that they're doing that can make you better, as opposed to like looking at this one person and it's like, yeah, that person was born with a 40-inch vertical. Maybe you're not going to get there. So like, what are the things you can control to work on? So that way you're not putting one person on a pedestal and you're not thinking about the outcome. You're thinking about the process to get there.
And I think that's a really good reminder too, is focusing on the process is so important. Like if your goals ever feel so far out of reach that they're creating anxiety, you got to bring it back to the process. And I think that idea of not putting people on a pedestal, because there's nobody who's so perfect and fantastical that they deserve to be up on a pedestal. If they're up on a pedestal, you get your own pedestal to get up on, because
Yeah.
we're all on the same level. Bring it back to the Buddhist ideas. So I think it's fantastic that you're able to say like, what are the actions that they're taking? One exercise that is done in mental performance consulting is called performance profiling,
Mhm.
where it says like, what is the goal that you're working towards? And if somebody already had that thing that you're working towards, what would they be doing on a day-to-day basis? Or what would be their character traits? How would they be showing up that has led to that success?
Yeah.
So it might be like the person who can lift the most, and the person that you're inspired and aspiring to be like eats their meals really consistently. It could be that they're getting enough sleep. It could be that they're hydrating properly. It could be that they are using their downtime in a way that's nurturing instead of draining, and like really monitoring their energy levels. It could be that they have a strength of focus, a strength of leadership, a strength of tenacity. And how can you hone these personal strengths? Because personality is flexible. So, like, how can you hone these strengths? And, like, if you want, maybe they have a strength in self awareness. So then you start journaling because you want to become more self aware. And all of these things, whether it's developing character or developing a physical habit or action and how you're showing up, all are part of the process. And we do not spend enough time talking about the process at
Yeah.
all.
No, I
Yeah.
agree. I agree. And you brought up journaling, and that's something that when you were talking about like encouraging words from others and encouraging words from yourself, I immediately went to like, yeah, journaling, that is a very powerful thing. Like writing it down is very powerful. And it brought me back to this idea that like, so with people that suffer from depression, which kind of goes in hand with everything that you talked about and laid it out. So I don't know if Bandura was looking at kind of that model to kind of think about this thing, but people that suffer from depression, they have memory deficits, and their memories tend to be more focused and anchored towards negative stimuli. So when you tell them like, hey, like just put on a smile, like, hey, just like, why can't you just be happy today? And it's like, well, because, or why can't you use positive words to describe yourself? It's because all their memories are negative. So the first thing that you talked about was like, well, look at your past to change your memories, right? So then when you can change your memories, then you can start changing the positive outlooks. And they've shown that within the research. Like if you're able to improve somebody's memory in depression, their episodic memory, their short-term memory, you're able to improve their depressive state because they no longer see negative stimuli as their only memory. They're able to start seeing positive ones. They're able to start seeing life differently. Then they can start using those words of positive affirmation and that stuff like that. So it does physiologically, like from the brain down, Bandura's thing does align with that beautifully. So when you said that, I was like, oh, that's awesome. It's cool to see all the connections come together. But the idea of like journaling positive words is something that I think is very powerful, and I think that um, that's something that kind of got I'm blanking on the word, but it got like captured as like a woo woo negative thing. Like, oh, journaling is like, who journals? Like, why are you journaling? Right. But when you look at the research on journaling and you look at the research of how powerful words are, like it makes total sense. One of the things they have people do with traumatic experience, PTSD and stuff like that is they have them journal, and they tell them like, okay, well, today you're going to journal for 45 minutes, and I want you to journal the experience as you see it. And they do that. It's an intensive process. And then they come back the next day and they say, I want you to do the same thing, but instead of using like negative words, use slightly more positive words. And they found that in 3 days of doing this journal process, they were able to alleviate a lot of the traumatic experiences because they were able to take the story that they had and have power over it, because they were able to now give it the words that they could give it, as opposed to the words that the person gave to them to create that trauma. And I think you can do that with sports and things like that. Like, yeah, maybe you don't think you're this or that, but like write it down, like convince yourself of it. Or something that we're doing in my lab right now is we're using the power of journaling to peers, right? So we know in the research that you're more likely to follow through with the things that you say, and you're more likely to be more compassionate with yourself if you're compassionate to others first. So one of the prompts we say is like, hey, if your friend wanted to get into exercise and they lack motivation to do it, like what are some words you could write to them to help them persevere and stick through the challenges and stuff like that. And what we're seeing in our research is like that's helping them have better positive valence towards exercise. That's helping them be more motivated towards exercise. And it's also improving their performance on the exercises that we're doing compared to the control group who's just journaling about their exercise experience. So it's like these things are very powerful. So is that something you also work with them too on journaling, or is it just kind of like vocal manifestation type of stuff?
Nah, I love a good journal prompt. The exercise you described reminds me of Kristen Neff's self compassion break.
Mm,
And Dr. Amber Mosowich, I'm not sure if you've read her 2013 article, but she did a similar intervention with women athletes. I believe she worked with self critical women athletes, and it's a prompt of describe the describe the challenge in a very neutral way to practice mindfulness. Or maybe it's treating yourself the way that you would treat a friend. Sometimes I get those two mixed up. But point being is that you talk to yourself the way that you would talk to a friend. And it's so powerful. And this is in the self-compassion work. And I love a good journal prompt. Sometimes I recommend that people get two different colors, and they can also like name their inner critic if their inner critic is the person that they're talking to. And so you have your inner critic in your journal in one color, and then you respond to it with your
mm,
wise, compassionate friend voice in the other color. Or sometimes we'll do like printing versus handwriting,
yeah.
but finding a way to differentiate these two voices, and then just going back and forth, because like we have conversations with ourselves in our heads, put them down on paper, and it's just like such a fascinating way to work through it when you have the visual cue of these two different voices that are in your head. But all to say, like, love journaling. I think writing is incredibly powerful, and they're like, when I talk to athletes, so often it's like, well, like free journaling, free writing is hard. Like,
Yeah.
what do I write about? And so, one prompt that I'll give them is to write about glimmers and moments of excellence. So, glimmers are sometimes often like those things that are outside of us that feel good. And then those moments of excellence are creating a list of like, oh, I actually am doing well. Again, if you're depressed and can't get out of bed, your moment of excellence could be you brushed your teeth today,
Yeah.
because sometimes that's hard.
Yeah.
And like, there's no bar of what your moment of excellence can be. So that's one of my sort of like easy writing prompts, and kind of like the same idea of like, don't tell me to be happy. When people tell me to write a gratitude list, I'm like, don't tell me what to be grateful for. Like, don't tell me to feel grateful. Grateful
Yeah.
might not be the feeling that I connect with. So if it's a moment of excellence, I'm like, yeah, nice, that was awesome.
Yeah.
I might not connect with the feeling of gratitude. So I've kind of tweaked that practice a little bit, because I'm like,
Yeah.
don't tell
Yeah.
me how I feel. But yeah, I have a ton of like love journal prompts. I think journaling is a fantastic way to build self awareness. And if we want to create any growth or grow in any area of life, we need to be aware. If you don't know where you're starting, how are you going to know? Like, how are you going to even start taking the next step?
Yeah.
We got
No.
to be self aware.
Yeah. Yeah. Self-awareness is definitely the key. And then just finding ways to manifest that is so valuable. And it's not a huge time domain either. It's just something that is simple, fast. So I love that. I definitely think that that's a bunch of powerful tools. Moving into this idea of like, when you deal with athletes, there's a lot of performance anxiety. There's a lot of injuries. There's a lot of these manifestations, like all these challenges that they have to deal with. What are some ways that you've found to help cope with these things, to help persevere through challenging times? What's some of the research showing specifically for the female athletes to kind of navigate this idea of challenging situations?
Yeah, I'm going to chat about performance anxiety specifically, just because just it was one of the first ones that you mentioned, one that I've chatted about recently, and I think connects to a lot of the other challenges that come up.
Yep.
So performance anxiety is fueled by, again, I have all these frameworks in my head because this is just this it creates such an easy way of guiding athletes through sessions. So I can't remember where this research came from, but performance anxiety is fueled by a desire to do well. You care about the thing, you want to do well in it. But then there's this lack of confidence that you can accomplish what's being asked of you. So we've already talked about confidence and how we can overcome this. Oh my goodness, people are getting so many of my little tidbits. People pay good money for this. um, and then, so I already talked about how to build confidence and how we can tackle performance anxiety through nurturing confidence. And then the third part of what fuels and stokes the fire of performance anxiety is being worried about what other people will think.
Yeah.
And when so often I'll have parents come to me and say, like, we don't put any pressure on our athlete. They put so much pressure on themselves. And I don't think I don't think people give enough credit to their reactions to success in sport, where they might not directly be saying you have to win to be valuable. But when you have a grand celebration for them getting the personal best or winning a competition, and don't have the same grand celebration when they fall in a race and rank last, you are teaching them that they have to be successful to be loved.
Yeah.
They have to be successful to get attention. And so I think there's this one, I guess I'm not sure. Like, I'm trying to tie it back to your question about like, what are the tools and skills to help athletes overcome a lot of these challenges. I think performance anxiety, the reason why I talked about it is it connects to fears around injuries. Because if you're injured and you can't perform at the same level, and you're worried about what other people will think, performance anxiety,
Yeah.
or anxiety of some form. And then if you have worried about how you're going to perform because it's a big competition and there's more pressure, comes back to this idea of worrying about what other people will think. So much of our fears and challenges come from what we think other people will think,
Yeah.
even if those things never cross other people's minds. We just are the center of our own little worlds and assume other people think this much about us. And people might have their judgments. People think that way. And sport's a competitive world. So I'm not saying those things aren't happening, but really creating separation from other people's opinions and your self-worth. And also, like, how are we shifting the opinion you have of yourself? Because maybe it's not so much that we're worried about what coach is going to say, but maybe you're mean to yourself and you're actually afraid of your own reaction.
Yeah.
So much of it comes back to just how can we start seeing our own value just because we're here showing up, and we don't need to accomplish a certain thing in order to be worthy of love and validation. And I think your comment before about journaling, where the first day they did this, the second day they did this, the third day they did this, it's a process.
Yeah.
Our inner critic develops before the age of 7, I think, is kind of what the literature says. Obviously, it's going to be a little different depending on each individual, but I've started to use this metaphor of a sponge. So we're a sponge for information when we're a kid, because we're just trying to figure out how the world operates. It's a big scary place. What's going on? And we assume that everybody knows more than we do. So as soon as somebody says something, we're like, fact, that's like grabbing onto that. The challenge is all of this water that we're absorbing is sometimes is like dirty water,
Mm.
and it's tainted with all of these stories that aren't true. Like, you could have the teacher say like, oh, like, I'm like, what could a teacher say where your little brain misconstrues and you just hold on to that, of like, your teacher could say like, it's taking you longer than normal to catch on to this. Then it becomes a story of, I'm bad at math. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of you being anxious about math, which makes it harder to study for math. So then it's harder to be good at math. And so, like, even though that's not what your teacher said, that's how your little brain made sense of it. And that's where we start to internalize these stories.
Mhm.
And so then you think you have 7 years of absorbing all this dirty, tainted water. It's going to take time to start wringing yourself out, plus building new stories with water that's a little bit cleaner. And so I think that like, we have to wring ourselves out, which takes time, and we have to start absorbing these new stories and be willing to be open to them. So that's one metaphor that I've been using, just to highlight that it's not going to be any one skill, but I can guarantee that it will take time. But if you show up and put in the effort, if you want to be the athlete that is confident, do the mental performance training so that you can be the confident athlete. Like, it's possible. You just got to do the thing to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really great. One of the things you touched on was the example of the teacher, and it could be something that you think of as a positive affirmation, right? So, growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Carol Dweck has done a lot of research on that. And what they found was, when students got praise for intelligence, they found that those kids created this identity of like, I am smart. So whenever things get presented to me that are super challenging, I'm actually not going to go away from that. I'm actually going to go away from that, because if I get that answer wrong, then I'm not going to be smart anymore. And then they found them that they're more likely to cheat on tests because they need to get an A because they're perceived as intelligent. Whereas the other group, the growth mindset group, they were told about their work ethic, like, oh, you're working so hard, you're doing, and they found that those kids actually found more challenging things to be more delightful. They enjoyed the challenging things because that's what they were getting praised for. Both of them sound like, yeah, that's good praise both ways. But one precipitates this intelligence that they don't have control over, and then one precipitates like effort is the key, right? And you're going to
Yeah.
go towards whichever one you start to believe, because our mind, our brain is this prediction error machine, right? So we have all these predictions based on the past, and then every time something new comes up, that's an error, and that goes back into the prediction method. So every time you get something, you just ingrain that prediction, ingrain that memory, and then that definitely becomes you over time. But we know at any age your brain's plastic, so you can rewire those thoughts simply by doing the things of like, what am I telling myself? Oh, I'm telling myself effort is important over winning, so therefore I'm going to think about how much effort I can put into things as opposed to how much winning I'm going to do. And those shifts are so powerful. And even the thought of like, I want to shift my perception of anxiety, right? So like anxiety are these feelings that I have when something comes up. This Lisa Bear Feldman, she focuses on like emotions and how emotions are made and emotion regulation. And one of the stories she tells was her daughter, her like 6 year old daughter, was in karate and she was at a tournament, and she told her coach, like, "Oh, I'm nervous. Like I got this tingly feeling in my stomach." And the coach said, "Oh, that's not nerves. That's like energy. That's giving you the power so that you can do this. That's your body giving you." And it's like just that perception change makes it like, "Oh, this isn't a negative thing. This is actually like it's giving me superpowers. Like, oh, I'm ready to attack." Right? Like those things are so easy to do.
Yeah, and we talk about reframing performance anxiety as excitement or energy.
Yeah.
That is a skill. Like that
Right.
reframe is so simple and it takes practice, but can go such a long way. And this like anxiety we perceive as a negative thing and something we don't want, and excitement's a good thing. And so I tend to talk about energy, or I tend to talk about energy or activation and how are you feeling in your body rather than labeling it as an emotion sometimes, because those sensations in your body are what matter. And if we can interpret them in a way that's supporting our success, well, that's going to be so much better for us. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm hearing so many connections in all of the topics as we've gone on this journey. It's fabulous. I love it.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's great how like it's like they put a lot of thought into this stuff and makes it connect.
Right.
Right? Like
It's
amazing,
all making
amazing.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Getting into we touched on this idea that like academia and research is very male focused, male dominant for a very long time, and now we're starting to focus more on females and what are some of the differences. Like I said, my friend Olivia, her main focus is female athletes, looking at bone mineral density, reds, and all that type of stuff to see what's going on. And they're doing all kinds of research with the athletes at Oklahoma State, and it's amazing stuff. But what are some of the like what are some of the barriers that are we still facing barriers for females to do research? And one that is salient to me is I know that there was this group that wanted to do research on females, and whenever you do research, you're like, okay, this is the age that I want to do research on, right? And this wasn't an athlete thing, this was like a cardiovascular thing. And they were like, well, I want to do it from 18 to like 40. And you're like, well, why did you pick 40? It's because we don't want to mess with menopause. Menopause is messy, so we're not going to do research on that because that might mess up the results, right? And you'll hear that all the time, like, oh, what birth control are you on? Oh, we don't want to do research on that birth control. That's messy. Like, so I'm guessing that's one of the things that are still plagued in female research. But like, what else are we seeing? And even extrapolate on that if you want to.
Yeah, I don't know if people watch this visually, but my face says a lot. I do not play poker. Thank goodness, because I would lose. So I have friends who are having babies. I have family who are going like in perimenopause and going through menopause. And it is fascinating to have conversations with these very intelligent women who are like, there is nothing out there.
Nothing.
Like, especially when you think in academia, we have access to journals. We're in this silo. What do we call it? It's our ivory tower of knowledge. And it takes 10 years to get current research out to the general population.
Mhm.
That blows my mind. So I so appreciate platforms like this where you can have high like knowledgeable people out there in a way that's accessible to people, because that's what we need. So I think maybe that's one of the challenges we face right now is we are in an ivory tower, and to be able to access this fresh, hot off the press literature, one, you need to be able to understand academic language. And so even for me, I'm an academic, but for me to go and read a paper on the biology and physiology of menopause, it's a whole different ballgame. But like, and then academic writing on top of that is a challenge. And then you So like if you're in the area, you need to be able to read it. But we just keep everything like everything so gate kept and so precious. And it's like, why is this not all just out there for people to read?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, it's so wild how we're like, that's messy, so we're not going to touch it. When again, it goes back to the idea of like, you're in research to ask questions. And why aren't
Yeah.
you asking the questions about the women?
Yeah.
Probably because the women haven't been the one asking the questions.
Very true.
Um,
Yeah.
so
True.
yeah, anyways, I think it's just crazy the lack of research we have. And at least when you're in middle school and you get a conversation about how your body's going to change as you go through puberty, there ain't nobody talking to you about your body changes when you're an adult.
No. No.
Like nobody. Everybody's just like, I hope you have the tools to deal with it at this point in your life.
Yeah, you'll
Good for
figure it
you.
out.
You
It's
know, like figure it out.
it's women's intuition. You'll get it going. You'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So my other thought that came up as as you were asking this question was, do you know more about the I saw something on social media recently about grant applications being flagged for language around women, basically.
Hmm.
Do you know anything about this?
Is this the DEI initiative that's going on and the NIH funding restrictions that are going on and stuff like that? That's what comes to mind. I'm not sure.
Maybe there was just a long list of words that if you had any of these words in your grant application, it would be flagged for
That's
basically
scary.
deeper review, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. I think that if we're using this language, we need to make sure we're doing things properly. And if we are separating out men and women versus females and males, versus like how are we keeping things clear and inclusive to everybody involved?
Hmm.
So I kind of get it on one hand, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, are you not doing the same if people mention men athletes? Or are you
Right.
only caring if people mention women athletes?
Hmm.
So not
Yeah.
like, and so again, I don't know, it might be what you're thinking. I just saw a long list where it's like, if you use these words in your grant application, it's going to get flagged. Basically, you're going to have to provide extra justification as to why you're using that language, is where my head goes as somebody who's had to apply for grants before.
Is it the
But
language of like gender differences, sex differences, that type of thing? Like they want you to
no,
use,
it's like it's women,
why are you doing
female,
research on women?
like sexual assault. Apologize if that's a trigger warning, but like it was very much it was a very gendered, sex-based list that was biased towards women, saying that if these are the things you're including in your grant application, it's going to get flagged for like deeper, more critical
Huh. I mean,
analysis.
the only thing that I can think of is if they're trying to parse out naturally menstruating versus on the pill. Which pill are they on? Like, why did you pick this sample size? As with men, like those things aren't important. Like your sample size is not as.
The privilege.
I know, but it's true, right? Like
Yeah.
there's your sample size needs like you need to have more justification for your women's sample size than you do for your male sample size. And maybe that's, I don't know,
I
maybe
know, and that's where I'm like, I don't know if this is a bad thing or not, but it is
yeah,
definitely a a moment of like,
flag.
what's going on?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, and I do something that I find wonderful to see is the number of women who are in my college in particular.
yeah.
A lot and like a lot of powerhouse younger women. So that's really cool to see. I really do not align like I feel like such a non-traditional academic, kind of like I am in sport, where like these are both very high performing spaces, and I'm like, I guess I'll publish because I have to. And like,
Yeah.
I like
Is
I
that
could not care
imposter syndrome
less.
or is that what is that?
Pardon?
Is that like imposter syndrome? Like what is that that's going on? Do like you feel like you don't fit in this field? Like what are we talking about with
I
that?
think it's the egotistical masculine culture that is traditionally academic, like what that is academia traditionally is.
Yeah.
They both have this hyper competitive, egotistical, who's doing better, and it's all just a pissing contest for lack of better language. And I'm like, nice. Are you having fun? I'm having fun.
Yeah.
like, and
Yeah.
so I really, um, I don't know if there's anything in particular that stands out. Being a woman in sport, it is really exciting right now because the whole like women are getting more airtime, women are getting better airtime, um, is really fabulous to see. So I will say, like, it's really exciting to be a woman academic in sport right now. And I am fortunate enough to be surrounded by powerhouse women academic colleagues. So
Yeah.
like we started the conversation talking about this like a support system. I see a lot of powerhouse women academics. So when it comes to like entering the space, I never felt like it was a like super male dominated, or that wasn't something that made me hesitant to come into the culture made me hesitant to come into academia,
Yeah.
not the women who were in the space. And because I'm so deep in the silo of women in sport literature, I'm like, do we have research on men in this? Which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
Because like you asked about like the sex-based differences of like of my brain went to self-compassion. And I'm like, there is some literature out there, but it's like kind of unclear and there's not a ton of it. And this is an area of, I focus on women athletes and that's fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like it. I mean, for me personally, like I like the idea of um having a diverse lab as much as possible because you get different perspectives. Like I want somebody that's like neurodivergent on one side. I want somebody that's, female. I want somebody that is this, like I want as many diverse people in there as possible that like challenge you and that like give you this perspective. And you're like, oh, I didn't see things that way because of like the way I grew up. It's awesome. Like the military did that for me. It opened my eyes to like, oh, like you're from Alabama. I've never met anyone like you before. Like, oh, this is fascinating. Like I'm learning so much, right? And then I think that allows you to like ask better questions in your research and all this other stuff. Um, so I do like that there's more diversity coming in to academia. My only concern is, and it's hard to say it's a concern because I always think like people should go to where their passion is, but like if your passion creates a silo, is that is that a concern, right? Like, but then it's like, how do you get men interested in female research, right? That might be something that like through going on podcasts, like through exploring the knowledge, like maybe that'll get them more interested. But like maybe having a male perspective in a siloed female thing might be good. I don't know. Like I don't know. Like the idea of like siloing yourself off.
I know, and that was like, I hope that that's not like a. I think it's one of those things of like I sometimes forget that the general knowledge we have is knowledge on men.
Yep.
And that is something that I highlight in my research where like so there's been a lot of self-compassion. My dissertation is focused on developing a self-compassion program tailored to women athletes. Women athletes have been involved in the process. And some of the reason why I say this is needed and this, like, we need to involve women athletes in the process is because, yeah, there have been successful programs done in the past that stayed in the literature. Why haven't they been implemented elsewhere?
Yeah.
Where, like, and we don't have, even if they were, there's not a ton of justification in any of the programs I've read about why they chose to implement them in a certain way. But even if they're, and I also acknowledge that like word count makes it hard to publish
Yeah.
without justification sometimes. So that's where I'm like a critical eye. I'm not saying they didn't do their due diligence in structuring this, but even if they did, all of the intervention literature out there is based on men.
Yeah.
So how relevant is it really? And if it's stuck in the literature, maybe there's a reason why it's stuck in the literature.
Right. Not only is it based on men, but it's probably based on white college age males. One of my favorite books is this book called Weird, and it's an acronym, and it's like Western, educated. I always forget the I, rich, democratic, and it's this academic guy, and he's talking about like how we build our ideas on this population of people when that's the minority of people in the world. And he gives all these examples of like different places that have different ideas of how they do things. And one thing that's like salient to me is like the idea of suppression as a tool to deal with anxiety and depression. And in America, what we found is that if you suppress your feelings, then the person that you're suppressing it with has a negative reaction to it, because we regulate our nervous systems based on how we interact with each other. But what they found was in Japan and in those cultures over there, they find suppression as a positive thing. So if you suppress your feelings with another person, that actually has positive emotional regulation strategies for them, because their concept is culture and you're not bigger than the family, and therefore it's better for you to suppress your feelings than to make the whole family feel it. Where in America, we're like, we're individualistic. I want you to feel what I feel, and if you don't feel what I feel, then I'm going to get upset, and then you're going to get upset because I'm not fully expressing myself. So even that like little thing is like different cultures create different, but we don't study that. We were like, what's the easiest participants to get in? And I like, even I see this a lot too. It's like you'll get one cohort in for a study, and they're like, oh, like this was easy to get in. When in my next study, I'm going to email those same 30 participants and be like, hey, I got another study coming up. Do you want to do that? And it's like, well, then what's this like? What are the sample sizes that we're actually getting here? You know? So I think that's another thing that needs to be looked at as well, because we know that there's differences in ethnicities, differences in like there's differences in everything, but we're just like, well, we need to publish and we need to do this. So we got to make it as fast as possible. What's the easiest way to do it? And I think you're right. That is like a liability within academia, how they structure everything and how it's all externally incentivized as opposed to internally intrinsically incentivized is a major problem. And one thing you did touch on, and sorry to keep rambling, and this is I'm interviewing you, but
Good.
you talked about like the write-in process, and I found that in academia there's a lot of people that write for other academics and not a lot of people write for the population who is actually paying us to do the research. So it's like, yeah, you used a bunch of big words, but only 10 people know what you're talking about. So what was the point of your research, right? And I think we need to do a better job of that. Like, how can we get these complex ideas and distill it into like manageable, understandable key concepts that people can read and go and run with, right? And like, yeah, there's a lot of ways we can structure academia a lot better. I agree with that.
Well, I think the focus is just not on knowledge translation.
Yeah.
And and I think maybe it's going that way more so now, but even then knowledge translation is often an academic conference. And so you're just continuing to tell the same people about the things that you did in an academic
Right.
way. And and so then it's like, why, like, knowledge translation needs to be at a population level. Who are
Yeah,
these results for?
exactly.
And how are we communicating it to the people that the results are for? And so something that we do in our research is follow up with a summary of results and send it to the people who took part. And something that I really try to make a priority when I'm doing my sessions is to teach it in a way that they will understand. I don't need to use the word self-efficacy. Sure, I can teach it to them. And some of them are going to be, I always tell them to go home and say, what did you learn today? Self-efficacy. Cool. But like, they don't need to learn all of the deep theory and all the other big words that come with the theory.
Yeah.
And so in these sessions, we're doing knowledge translation, but I think it needs to be emphasized more. And like, some of the jargon and the frivolous language that is used in academic writing, it's just like, get over yourselves.
Yeah.
The whole like, I'm educated and I don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, it drives me crazy. Like I'll see people coming out of exercise science and they'll get into personal training and they're like, oh yeah, today we're going to work your vastus medialis, your vastus lateralis, your sartorius. And like, what? And they're like, your quadriceps. And they're like, what? The front of your leg. Oh, let's just start with the front of my leg. Like, how about that? Like,
Exactly.
what are
But
we
I think
doing?
we get excited when we're like,
You
I
know,
know
we do
fancier
get
words,
excited.
and look at me prove my intelligence by using my fancy words.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's
Anyway.
yeah, we're like the idea is like we're trying to bridge the gap. And I think one of the things that helps that be more salient to you is you do research, but then you also apply it to athletes at the same time. So you're getting like instant feedback of like, am I actually bridging the gap or am I still missing the holes? Whereas if you just do research, you never know if you're bridging the gap because like, how do you know it's translating? So you get that real time feedback. Not everyone gets that. I just want to make sure everyone knows in research, like not everyone gets that. So it's a very awesome position to be in, and I'm sure it helps like dynamically shift the way that you're thinking about how you do your research. What are some of the things that you learned from your athletes that have shifted the way you started to do your research?
Hmm. So I think what's fascinating, things that I've learned from my athletes, I'm not sure if it's necessarily come from in session, but in my research, because I took such an athlete-centered approach in qualitative research, so I was running interviews and focus groups with athletes, it's just I find qualitative data such a fascinating way of understanding the population that you're working with. And to understand that sometimes the way we've framed their challenges in the research doesn't really capture what they meant. And so something as simple as like one of the main challenges women athletes experience is poor performance. But I don't think that captures the nuance of it's not a poor performance, it's I didn't perform up to my expectation.
Yeah.
So you probably still performed well, but how high was your expectation? And that's where the pain and suffering comes in when there's a gap in expectation and reality.
Yeah.
And I don't think the literature quite gets at the nuances of things like that. What also comes to mind, and I know this isn't quite answering the question that you asked, but the idea of working, like I get the opportunity to say, like, hot off the press, athletes, this is the newest literature, and you get it because I'm the person in front of you. But I think if you're somebody if I was only in academia, I would be looking at the relationship between self-compassion and constructs. I'm trying to think of all the constructs that we previously had in this research. I've changed our project a lot, but we were looking at mechanisms of self-compassion and how self-compassion worked. And like what are the nuances that are going into self-compassion that are related to our stress response? And in talking to my supervisor, I'm like, why? We know self-compassion is good. Let's get it to them. Like why do we care how it works? That's
We
not what
love
I want to be doing.
we love our
And so,
mechanisms.
pardon?
We love our mechanisms in research, that's for sure.
Yeah, and like still a very cool question, but also
Yeah.
like, is it applicable to the population of interest? And I don't think we necessarily have that applied. How is it going to actually impact the people who we're asking the question about? Sometimes it's just personal interest. Well, I care about this and it's relevant to some other stuff that I've been doing research in, but what's the actual real life application? I think we're so interested in the generation. Are we even taught knowledge translation as a generation of research? Like, generation of research is like, build it brick by brick and don't put it out into the public until all of these beautiful bricks have been built. And I'm like, until we put it out to the public, we don't even know if people care about these bricks.
Yeah, or if it works. Yeah, no, I
They're like, are
agree.
the bricks going to work when it's minus 50? We don't know.
Right.
And so I think it's just like having the real life experience or having the applied experience of working with women athletes just really made me realize that it's like, why are we waiting to get this out there?
Yeah.
You just go. And
Yeah.
then you can do the mechanisms work in the background. I'm not doing that for my dissertation because that is going to that's just going to delay the process of getting this to athletes longer.
Yeah.
Like your
Yeah.
mechanism work can be an easy behind the scenes study of throw some measures together and work on a manuscript together.
Man.
Not my dissertation.
Way to minimize mechanistic research. Man, Carissa, people are gonna be so upset about that.
But
But
like to do the mechanisms, it's send a survey out to some people and analyze the data.
yeah, okay.
Not the applied programming of,
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes we need to know the mechanisms. I get the physiology. Because what is your back? Is your background physiology, sociology? You've
Exercise
talked about
science
a
and
lot of
psychology, yeah.
psychology.
And exercise science, yeah.
Oh, okay. Ooh, fancy, interdisciplinary.
Very, very fancy, yes.
I like this. Okay. Um, I'm just thinking like sometimes physiologically speaking, we do need to understand things better.
Yeah, of course, of course.
And like once you do programming, you do research on interventions. Once you know a little bit, and then you see how people respond, and oh, that's not quite what we expected. Go back to understand mechanisms better. There's not enough programming on self compassion to even go back to say like, oh, what's going on here, because we haven't done any programming with women athletes on a
Yeah.
grand scale. Like,
No,
not even, I'm not even doing a grand scale, I'm doing an implementation study. But I just think that there needs to be both. Like, look at the mechanisms, applied in an intervention. Oh, what's not there, look at the mechanisms again, then apply it again. And just like, there needs to be more application of sports psychology in particular, because I think we are very from what I've experienced, and this again, this could just be the world that I live in, but it does feel like a lot of it just cycles around what are all the theories that we're doing instead of how are we actually getting these resources to people and helping people make changes.
yeah.
I think
Well,
that's
because
an important part.
theories are way easier to write than interventions.
That is true. Oh my goodness.
That's probably why you get that. And there's nothing better than being an academic theorizer and philosophizer and not actually having any proof of it, right? Because that's what I see. Like, exercise science does this all the time. It's like, well, I think your theory is wrong, and here's my theory. It's like, well, why don't you just do the intervention to like show us? And they're like, no, no, no. I'm just going to continue to manifest theories and not actually put it into practice. I'm like, that drives.
Exactly. Yeah. So we need to put it into practice. And I think my applied experience has really highlighted how critical it is to put research into practice instead of keeping it in our little ivory tower.
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely like that philosophy. So let's just wrap up here with this last little bit. What are some of the common myths that you have to overcome with female athletes in sports psychology? Like, is there anything that perpetuates time and time again that you see that's like, why do you guys think this way? Like, this is actually what's going on, you know?
Yeah, I think so. Myths for women athletes. I think that one, especially because I work with young women athletes, so I hear from a lot of parents that young women are putting pressure on themselves, and it's like they didn't magically start putting pressure on themselves. It came from somewhere. So let's
Right. You
just
don't come
address
out the
that.
womb with like, I'm going to be an Olympic athlete, right?
Right? Yeah. And but then all of a sudden I'm doubting my skills to be an Olympic athlete. No, we're born with hopes and dreams. We are born from a place of love, and we're taught fear and hate. And I know, like, sometimes I share these ideas, and I have like these very like hippie Eastern ways of thinking, and
Yeah,
so
I
it's
like
a
that. I do too.
yeah. If it hasn't been obvious so far, something else that myths. I had two other things that came to mind when you talked about myths. Oh, something that comes to mind is the stigma around mental performance training and asking for support. So, one of my favorite sessions that I offer is actually about grit. And one of my colleagues, she's now working out of the University of Alberta, Dr. Danielle Cormier. She is working on she's in the process of publishing a grounded theory of grit. So I won't give away too much, but the way I frame it is that gritty athletes have a solid support system at the end of the day. So with that, part of being a gritty athlete is supporting yourself.
Hmm.
And there's a few different ways that you can support yourself, but also being a gritty athlete requires support.
Yeah.
So if we like grit in sport culture and you want to be a gritty athlete, asking for help is part of that. And there is no shame in wanting support to overcome challenges, because stuff gets hard sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's not that there's anything wrong with you, and it's not that you are in like a victim mode or that you're weak, but it's just there's no shame in saying, let's like help me do this thing because I care about doing this thing.
Yeah. Do you think that's manifested in youth sports? Because a lot of youth sports for female athletes, and maybe it's changed, since I've been involved in youth sports, but most of them are taught by men. And a lot of males stigmatize therapy as weakness. So if you're being taught at a young age that like your emotions don't matter, go cry behind the bench and then come back and like that type of stuff, then yeah, that's going to be very hard to overcome that stigma. So it is something that at your level, at the collegiate level, that it should be talked about more and more, because the more you talk about it, the more common it feels, the less stigmatized it becomes.
Yeah, and I think there used to be this perception that asking for professional support, maybe I should put that caveat in there, but like asking for professional support used to be support was like, oh, you're going to go see a shrink, like a negative connotation, when it's like,
Like, oh,
we
you're
all
you
just need
can handle it
support.
yourself. Yeah.
We all just need support, and support looks different. And, sometimes I think I was talking to my psychiatrist. I forget because I talk to so many professionals where like I go and see the student support coordinator and I see her multiple times a week, just like sitting in her office talking about life. And I have a psychiatrist and I have a counselor and I have like, this is my area of expertise. And I still have three professionals that I talk to on a regular basis. And it's okay because we all just need support and everybody's support system looks different. And
Yeah.
depending on what's going on in life, you lean on them more or less, depending on how much you need them. But sometimes you just need a different perspective from
Yep.
the people who you're typically around. And when it comes to like men coaching women's sport, I've been fortunate, and maybe this is a reflection of the conversation where like I've been fortunate enough where any of the teams that I interact with often have a male coach, but are also very much like, no, please come in and have these
Yeah.
conversations. But also, I wouldn't be there if the coach wasn't like, we're open to this. So, it's like, obviously, I'm only seeing the coaches who are supportive of it because they're supportive of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of coaches out there who aren't supportive of it and are like, no, we'll figure it out. And how about just tough it up and you're the problem. You like, there's,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think the stigma, not necessarily a myth, but definitely a stigma around reaching out for mental performance support.
Yeah. I guess the
Um,
myth would be that mental support is weakness.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Yep. Can appreciate that frame. Um, and other myths, sometimes something that comes up in the literature that I've read, and okay, this is reminding me that I do read some about men's experiences in sport, or at least hear about them, because I read this really fascinating article, and I would have to go back in my archives to find the author. But they did this project where they talked about coaches.
Chris, can you hold that thought for 1 second?
Highlighted coaches' perceptions of women athletes. And so it wasn't necessarily men or women coaches, but it was just coaches of women athletes. And something that they talked about was, or how they talked about women athletes was, any trait a woman displayed that didn't align with traditional sport culture was a problem. And so this idea of like, they're more emotional. They want to know why we're doing things, where boys just listen to me. And and also like, they show emotions. Men get angry too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like,
Our
you,
emotion spectrum is much more limited, but they're very intense, you know?
yeah. And so I just found it so fascinating that it's like, even though these coaches often claim to take a gender neutral approach, it was still very much favoring this experience of men athletes. So, okay, this is where the other myth is that, and this is recent literature, like this isn't old. Um, Again, I wish I had the author's name, but I think a myth is that women and men have equality in sport. And that's not sports psychology specifically, but like this idea that, like, I had a conversation with an academic peer who was like, women don't get the funding because they don't bring in the money. And I'm like, women can't bring in the money when they're not being televised. Women can't bring in the money when you're not selling seats to their games. So it's this systemic problem. And I think this was a conversation that, again, I had with an academic 2 years ago.
Hmm.
So there's still this stereotype perpetuated that people don't care about women's sport. And I know that that's changing, and that's why it's fabulous to be part of women's sport right now. But it's still, we are just so far behind when it comes to access to funding, when it comes to gym times. When I hear that a women's volleyball team gets the trash time to train at because the boys had to train first, why?
Yeah. Yeah.
It still is happening.
Yeah. You know what's crazy is that I think the one sport that it doesn't happen in is MMA. Like this brutal fight sport, women and men get paid relatively the same, the champions, and they get, but from a spectator's point of view, like everyone looks at the women fighters the same way they look at the male fighters. And why that's the case, I'm not 100% sure, because I know that men or people tend to look at NBA like and WNBA like those aren't even the same sport, but like in MMA, this brutal you know, and it's just
Very like tough, like you would think that like, grr, that's masculine.
yeah, but the women get so much respect in that sport. Like sometimes they're even like I'm like, "Oh, she's fighting?" Like that's like I want to watch that one, right? And it's like and I see that perpetuated through like all these MMA fans. I do jiu-jitsu and MMA, so that's why I'm really geeked out on it. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's like and it's just fascinating to me that this brutal sport manifests more equality in how we perceive athletes than any other sport that I've ever seen.
Yeah. That's rad. I love that. Love a lady fighter. Okay, that also, my brain still has so many ideas. When you say that, I just want people to also get fired up about the weight classes for women's wrestling at the Olympics.
Oh, I saw yeah.
If we want something to fight about that, because a woman wrestler in the Olympics is something like 76 kilograms. That is not a large lady, especially for an athlete. Men's goes up to like 180 kilograms. Let's fight about that.
I think the I think the men's are 125 plus.
Okay, 125. Drastic. That's still 50 more kilograms than a woman is
Yeah.
allowed to be. Whatever
Yeah.
that math is, that was not the right math. But
Yeah.
again, I'll trust you on that number. I don't know these. I just know there's a massive difference. So that got me fired up.
I
Talk
thought you
about
were going
equality.
in I thought you were going into something because I love combat sports and the NCAA just made women's wrestling college sport. So I thought you were going to go into that as far as like growth in the sport and
I'm
everything
sorry, that just happened. Women's wrestling?
as like yeah NCAA Division 1 collegiate sport through like all of the colleges now. It was more like just a few
Oh,
here,
like
there. Yeah.
gotcha. It
So
took
I
until
think
20 it took until now to figure that out? Like
yeah.
to put that out there? Anyway, okay, so point being, we are behind. You have just affirmed that like we are not equal. We are still very behind and have a lot of growth before we are actually on an equal playing field. I had another one and it slipped my brain. Another big thing that gets talked about a lot in sport as a challenge for women athletes is that women have to battle this. And you talking about MMA fighters brought this up and how they're seen on it as like equal players. We're like, rad, these women are awesome, look at them getting down and dirty, right? Women in traditional sports like basketball, probably MMA as well, but there's this balance between, I train to be good at my sport, so I might be muscular,
Hmm.
I might look a certain way, and like I might have these really thick thighs because we're powerful, and that's where like your thighs, your legs are so powerful, so you're thick, and like, and then society is telling you that you have to be lean and
Yeah.
thin, and so you're training in this sport to be really excellent as an athlete. And then when you're living your day-to-day life, society is like, yeah, but your body looks weird. You're built like an athlete, and that's a bad thing. And so we face so much pressure around our bodies
Hmm.
to perform a certain way and look a certain way in sport.
Yeah.
Where like also if we show up too feminine and how dare we do our hair or makeup, for an event that makes us feel confident and empowered, that's too feminine for sport.
Or
But
too
then when we're
sexy, or
existing
too,
in,
it's always
go ahead,
too
Harry.
something, right? Like too sexy, too this, too that. Women are definitely always too much.
Yeah.
And they need to fit within this like dynamic stereotype that males feel comfortable with. And it's like, can we get over that? Like, can we just
Thank
like,
you for saying that.
yeah.
Thank you for saying that this is all about what men are saying of us. And like, oh, we made men uncomfortable because we looked good in sport, and now we're making men uncomfortable because we look strong and jacked on the street. It is men's perceptions
Of
because
course
women
it is.
women would not care. The objectification and self-objectification of women is wild.
Yeah. And the thing that kills me is just like the negative ramifications of the mind, the body that women like that it perpetuates to women. Like, oh, you got to look a certain way. Okay, well, I'm going to restrict my calories. Then my bone mineral density is going to go bad. Then I'm going to have hormone
And
dysregulation.
that's where reds comes from. And then it impacts your performance. And then like, and so yeah, there's like so interwoven where, and then it's the psychological game of now I'm spending so much energy and trying to manage what my body looks like instead of just spending energy focused on my performance and living my life.
Yeah, I agree.
So
I
that
agree.
is, and I know that men face their own unique challenges, like homophobia is something, and like vulnerability, speaking of like the stigma about reaching out for help, that is still there for men athletes. But once it's okay for men athletes, it's going to be okay for women athletes. And but women athletes will still have a lot of these things going on in the background that are unique to them, and they deserve their own unique support.
Yeah,
So
no, I agree.
that's the argument that I make for my research.
It's a good argument. I like it. I
Thank
like
you.
it. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Carissa. I appreciate all your knowledge and everything. I learned so much from this. I took a bunch of notes that I'll be looking into. So I appreciate you coming on and you know letting us know everything that you have about this stuff. It's fascinating.
Thank you. I appreciate being a guest. It's so much fun to get to chat at high level with somebody else who's in the area, maybe like a little bit tangential. So, yeah, I really appreciated the dialogue. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And as more research comes out, we'll have you back on and we'll do it again.
Beautiful. I'll hold you to it.
All right, take
Thank
care.
you. You too. Bye.